Hello.
All right, we are live now. Dear all, in the name of the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation for Freedom, I would like to welcome you to tonight's discussion on the aftermath of the global health crisis. My name is Christoph Klemann, and I'm the project director of the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation here in Lebanon. As a foundation that is based on liberal values, the principles of privacy, of economic freedom, and international cooperation are dear to our heart. But what we see in the current crisis is that these very principles are sometimes challenged. We observe massive state intervention in the economy. We see data apps that can track where we are and who we meet. And we see the closing of borders, even within the European Union. And while some of these measures are certainly justified for the moment, the question really is, in what kind of world we will be waking up after this is all over. And that is what we want to discuss today. And as this pandemic is a really global one, we thought it's important not just to talk about each other, but to have a discussion with each other across different countries and even tonight across different continents. And I'm very glad that we were able to bring together 3 parliamentarians from 3 very different countries. And before we start our discussion tonight, I would just like to introduce them very shortly to you. First of all, I would like to welcome Michel Moawad. He's a member of the Lebanese parliament and the leader of the independence movement, a party that has very close ties to our foundation and that we had very fruitful cooperation in the last years. I would like to welcome Alexander Lambsdorff, who's a member of the German Bundestag, vice chair of the parliamentary group of the FDP, and probably one of the foreign policy experts that we have in Germany and Europe. And I would like to introduce to you Adrian Vázquez Lázara. He's a member of the European Parliament, stemming from Spain. And he's probably the youngest committee chair the European Parliament has ever seen. And he is chair of the Committee for Legal Affairs in the European Parliament. And of course, last but not least, I would like to introduce Luna Safwan, who's our moderator for tonight. She's a freelance journalist here in Lebanon. And she's working on different, she has worked on different independent media outlets or international media outlets, such as Vice Arabia, also the British Telegraph. And without further ado, dear Luna, it's up to you to now start the discussion, start the moderation. I'm very much looking forward to this. And I wish us all a fruitful and interesting discussion.
Thank you so much, Christoph, and thank you for everyone who's listening and who's participating with us tonight. So before we dive more into our commentary and our discussion, it's important to also ask anyone who's watching us that they have the space to leave us live comments in the chat box so that we can try and tackle these questions. And also some logistics, since I'm based in Lebanon, some electricity cuts might happen all of a sudden. So I might disappear for a few seconds, but I promise you that I will be back. And I trust that the gentleman will be picking up the conversation and will keep me up to speed as I restart my internet quickly. So this is to avoid the awkward black screen that might show up at any moment. I'm very happy that we are having this discussion tonight because coronavirus or COVID-19 is not only about the Middle East or Lebanon or Europe or the US. It's really a global pandemic, and it has affected every single country differently, yet we are all being gathered around the same conversations almost that are happening, even in countries that are more advanced in different levels and in different subjects. We are all finding ourselves questioning the same politics, the same circumstances, and the same challenges, which is why this is a very important conversation to have. And since we're talking about a global pandemic, I wanted to start with a question, an opening question actually, that gives each of the gentlemen a short amount of time for them to discuss what is happening in their relevant countries. So I would like to start with Mr. Alexander and to ask, how did your country react to the coronavirus pandemic from your perspective? What is the current state of affairs, and how are you observing the situation?
Thank you, Luna. Thanks for having me. Now, the current situation in Germany is we have a population of 83 million. We have 160,000 officially documented cases of COVID. 120,000 of those have already survived. So we have about 40,000 active cases. The big challenge in the beginning was, and the big topic for discussion was, will we face a situation like in the north of Italy, with a lack of intensive care units, with a lack of ventilators, with these terrible images that were broadcast in all our living rooms from cities that we all know, particularly Bergamo. Now, it turns out that has not happened. It has not happened. We have about 30,000 intensive care beds here, of which, as we speak today, 13,000 are empty. So we could have more cases, we could treat more cases. That would be a possibility. And that situation has led really to two big discussions. One discussion is about the indicators. How do we measure the severity of the crisis? How do we decide when we can reduce sort of the intensity of the measures that were taken, like border closings and closing of schools, interdiction of meetings, that you all have, that we all have, that we all know? So the indicators were, first, intensive care beds. We need enough of them available. Well, we have enough of them available. The second indicator was the rate of doubling of infections should be below 14 days. It's now much below 14 days. And the third indicator was the so-called reproduction rate. How many people does an infected person infect him or herself? And there the chancellor said it had to be below 1.0. Well, it has been below 1.0. And that has led to a second discussion, a big discussion. Now, the justification for the measures. And this is where we stand. We are a federal system. Our federal states have somewhat different approaches. The Bavarians try to be the tough ones. Where I come from in the West, we try to be a bit more relaxed. But given the fact that we can't meet face to face, and all of this happens in social media and online, we have a bit of a tense atmosphere, a polarization in our society. You're either accused of wanting, of endangering people's lives, or you're accused of ruining our economy. And there doesn't seem to be anything in between. So we have to come back to a situation in which we are able to discuss in a civilized, democratic way the shades of gray that are the reality of Corona, rather than trying to divide the world into black and white. That's where we stand in Germany, in my observation. And I'm really, really excited to hear where things stand in Spain and Lebanon. Thank you.
I'm going to move to Mr. Michel in Lebanon and build up on what Mr. Alexander was saying. We have one of the biggest challenges, which is the lack of medical equipment. So this is something in common, but I would also like to see and to hear, in your opinion and from your perspective, where are we standing, given that the medical system is one of the biggest discussed challenges in Lebanon?
Thank you, Luna, and hello to everybody. Well, actually, in the debate that is happening, I think is a global debate between saving people's lives and not ruining the economy. I think that this dichotomy is not only a German dichotomy and black and white. It's a worldwide, including in Lebanon. The good in Lebanon, if I had to compare, we have some good news and actually some, unfortunately, very bad news. In terms of good news, the pandemic has not hit Lebanon very harshly. So we're a population of around we're a population of around 5 million, but there are 6.5 million people living in Lebanon, if we have to include the Syrian refugees, the Palestinian refugees. We're a very small country, so it can be very dangerous, because the number of inhabitants by square kilometers is very high. We're a very dense country. So we're at a little bit more than 10,000 square kilometers for 6 million people living in it. So, but the pandemic has not hit Lebanon very harshly. So until now, until yesterday, we had a little bit more than 700 cases reported, less than 30 deaths. So if you compare with the best countries, with best figures in the countries, that is very good. Now, what is very harsh is in Lebanon, like you very well pointed out, Luna, if I may, is that, yes, first of all, we do not have enough equipment. So we are equipped for maximum dealing with less than 1,000 beds, for one. And two, and that's the biggest problem and challenge we're having, is that Lebanon has been living in a distressed and very problematic social, economic, and political atmosphere well before Corona. So we've been living a revolution since October 17th, an uprising of the people against actually the system, the whole system. We have a poverty rate that has exceeded more than 50% of the population living in Lebanon. So we were a year ago at around a third of the population, which was already enormous. Now we're at more than 50%. That is on only 1 year. We have people do not have any more access to their money at the banks. We have a de facto capital control. The state has defaulted on its obligations and on the Eurobonds. So the very big problem we're having, and that's why we may need to be more severe than any other countries, is that if ever the pandemic grows within the population, then the government does not have the financial or economic means to face it. We are with a government without money. And two, the other very big problem is that the poverty rate is exploding, because actually we were having very severe problems, financial, economic, and social problems, and Corona made it only worse. So in most of the countries, or in all the countries actually, of course in Germany and Spain, and most of the developed countries, the lockdown has been coupled with measures, with packages, for small companies, for people staying at home, while in Lebanon we do not have that luxury. So we started with a lockdown before others, because we knew, or the government in this sense knew, that if we had a spread of the pandemic, they could not deal with it. So we closed schools, borders before Europe, and even before before Europe, not even, and before the States. But the very big problem we're going to deal with is now, okay, people stayed at home. We're going to have hundreds of thousands of jobless people. That was started before the Corona. That is going to be our biggest challenge, is the socio-economic situation after the coronavirus that started before Corona.
And I want to pick up from that point, which is exactly the state of affairs post coronavirus or COVID-19, to ask Mr. Adrian. It has been said, or it has been seen also, sadly, that Spain has been one of the epicenters of the spread of coronavirus, with the high rates and high numbers. How will Spain deal with the aftermath of this? We're talking about borders, we're talking about international relations, because this is a very challenging time, of course.
Well, thank you very much, Luna. Really happy to be here with Alexander, with Michel. I'm really glad to be invited by FNF to participate tonight. As you said, Luna, in Spain is probably one of the countries that has been hit the hardest. And within the European Union, it was the second to have a strong wave of the virus. If you see the numbers, like Alexander and Michel exposed from Germany and Lebanon, in Spain, as it is today, we know that there have been 211,000 infected people. And from that, almost 24,000 people that have passed away, that they have died because of the COVID. And all of these numbers, they're still really difficult to not believe, because it depends on how the countries count the people dying from the COVID. The numbers change a lot. And if you see the numbers from previous years on the same day, probably we are looking at much higher people that have passed away because of the pandemic. So before answering your question, I would say that from my perspective, how the people have suffered so much in Spain and in Italy, particularly within the European Union, the great sense that I have, and I think most of the population and the citizens have, is a sense of uncontrol and lack of trust. Because when we were looking at the news, what was happening in China, a lot of media didn't believe it. A lot of governments didn't actually start taking strong measures because there is a lack of trust, for example, with that country, with the information coming out from China. That's for example. And that lack of trust and that lack of readiness, of preparedness, has provoked what we have today, which is a situation that is critic, that we don't know how we are going to get out of this, because Alexander was explaining this very well at the beginning. We didn't know what was the span on days when it comes to the infection. We still don't know for how long the immunity is going to stay in us. It's going to be 6 months, it's going to be 2 years, 15 years. Are we going to be able to reach a group immunity, which is also a huge question within how we are going to focus this. So the only thing we can do, as I see, is to prevent second waves from coming. But at the same time, we have to understand that everything just cannot stop. The world cannot stop going around. And if we stop the economy, we are going to have much more crises in many other, not only economic, but social, political crises, because we see always that after big crises, what are the political movements that they usually grow? The extremes, populism. So we cannot allow the crisis to stop completely the world. What Germany has done, or Austria, for instance, for me are good examples of how they moved early. They did massive testing, and then they start developing a clear strategy to open up the country. Those countries like Italy and Spain, we had a lot of hardness to try to think on those things, because the administration of both states was under such big stress that it was impossible to cope with such humanitarian crisis that we were facing, and at the same time trying to develop plans to get out of the pandemic. Now, it is true that I think we are looking at the end of the first wave. I think that the European Union, although it started moving really slow, it started moving, and it started moving with a lot of solidarity. And I always say that the European Union is like a big elephant. It's almost impossible to make it move. But when it moves, it actually works and functions. So now what I'm looking at is trying to be ready to that second wave. I hope that this wave will not be before summer, but it's just a hope, because no one has the answer. And we are working a lot, at least from Spanish and European institutions, I know German and all the other countries from the European Union. We're working a lot on trying to develop measures like using new technologies, tracing apps, massive testing, massive storage of sanitary equipment. All those things that we have to be ready, because that second wave is going to come. We don't know when we are going to have the antidote, and we don't know for how long this virus is going to be among us. So we are looking to uncertain times, but that is why we have to be as ready as possible, and we have to work and collaborate with each other. That for me will be the key point.
I want to build on this last point, which is avoiding a wider spread, or also massive testing, and move to the technological aspect of the coronavirus or post-COVID-19 era. And I want to ask Mr. Alexander, building on what we were talking about, will we witness more surveillance under the umbrella of protection to track more coronavirus cases? Because it's also, for me as a journalist, this is something that I question a lot. Technology is very smart, but also it can be very tricky. And it might also be needed. In a time of a pandemic, exceptions might be needed. So, yeah.
No, you're absolutely right. It's one of these questions that we are discussing here in Germany as we are discussing them in Spain. I mean, Adrian chairs the Legal Affairs Committee. It's a legal issue about data protection, the right to privacy, but you have to balance that against another good. I mean, it's good to have your privacy respected, but there's also a good to have your life saved and your health preserved. And so balancing these goods is really what is sort of shaping our debate. I find it, frankly speaking, I find it disappointing that so far inside the European Union, no companies have really come forward with a tracing app that works and respects citizens' privacy at the same time. That should be possible. I mean, we are now discussing, whether Apple and Google should be the ones delivering this technology to us. Well, we're using Apple and Google all the time. I'm looking at an Apple computer and a Google browser. But there are issues when it comes to protecting our privacy, where my trust in these companies is really limited, and where my trust in the data protection regime that we have in Europe is much, much higher than the one that exists in the United States. And therefore, I believe we should have it. And frankly speaking, this is something that we're waiting every day now for a European company to present us with a tracing app. Now, second aspect of your question, does that mean more surveillance? It does not mean more surveillance if you have a decentralized saving of the data and a voluntary sharing of the data. That are the two criteria that need to be fulfilled. And then you can start right away, go for it and share the data voluntarily, because it's impossible for the poor people in the health offices to call everybody. I mean, literally, I'm a survivor of COVID. I've had it. And I was called by the people in the local office and say, how are you? Who have you seen? Who did you talk to? Who did you have dinner with? Et cetera, et cetera. But you can't do this on a large scale for a long time. And so the tracing app would really be a jump ahead. Now, it's really crucial that we respect these two principles: decentralized storage of data and voluntary sharing, not a top-down, heavy-handed government surveillance tool. That, I believe, in my view, would be the wrong decision in a critical time.
I want to also ask Mr. Michel, in a country like Lebanon, where we're having a lot of debates about digital rights and online freedoms, and the law is very twisted, some laws are still very old-fashioned, needs to be updated. Do you think that such an app or such technologies might be well perceived by the public when it comes to the good of the general health, or that they might also get a sort of a defense mechanism because we don't want to be surveilled, we don't want this access, we just want our personal freedom, even if there's a pandemic around?
Well, again, that is a discussion, that's an ongoing discussion that preceded actually Corona, even if the coronavirus made it come and is making it quicker. We're going to a world where there's more technology, there's more AI, artificial intelligence, there are more and more apps. So the discussion, for instance, between the United States and China on TikTok being used per what the Americans are saying by the Chinese government to get data on people, all this discussion is not specific to coronavirus. Now, yes, in Lebanon, we do have a problem with the legal framework concerning the personal human rights and personal liberties. And that was an issue that we were discussing in the parliamentary committees way before the coronavirus. And unfortunately, first we had the Lebanese parliament has been very slow on anything linked to technology. Just to give you an example, we had just a year ago, or a little bit more than a year ago, legalized the e-signature, a law that we started, or that Parliament started discussing in 2001, and the law passed in 2018 or beginning 2019. So we've been very slow, particularly slow. Second, I think that that's a general issue because technology and AI is moving so quickly that even I think parliaments, and I want to hear Adrian and Alexander's opinion, are not being able to follow legally as quickly as the technology is evolving. And I think that is going to go more and more quickly with AI. So yes, I understand that because coronavirus has erupted and has brought up the use of technology, even in the use of what we're doing today, actually, using this technology to be able to interact politically, socially, in terms of business and others, the apps that are specific to the coronavirus. But that is anyhow where the world was heading, even though coronavirus has maybe speeded up the process. But this is where we were heading, and year by year, with the development of artificial intelligence that is doubling and tripling and quadrupling the speed of where things are going, this is a debate between technology and transforming the world into an information sharing, intelligent world controlled by big tech giants, and between liberties of the people and individual liberties. That, I think, is going to be a debate that is going to outlive Corona, that started before Corona, even though coronavirus has speeded it up.
Thank you. I want to also get Mr. Adrian's opinion on this to wrap it up with this question regarding technology. So as individuals, are we going to be giving away our privacy to local and regional and international authorities plus tech giants? Because this is something that every individual citizen will be asking, away from governments, away from political entities. Are we handing them this over during the pandemic, or can government and independent entities push towards more privacy, as Mr. Alexander was saying, towards more wider lines of ethics regarding this?
I really agree with what Alexander and Michel said, but I mean, we are liberals, so we have to be pragmatic. So we have to find the middle way, the gray zone, on where our privacy starts and where our right to live begins as well. Because my dad is 82 years old. He takes the public bus every day to go shopping. I don't know for how long he's not going to be able to do that, unless there is some kind of device, technology, something that maybe can assure or reassure him to still taking the bus and go shopping. So first of all, we have to ask ourselves why we need this app or this technology now. Because it's a next tool that will not do anything without massive testing and sanitary capability. But the tool can help to do that, because it can make testing more efficient. It can reassure people security to go out sometimes. And it actually, you create a kind of a social bond responsibility that you have to take care of yourself and you have to inform what is going on with you, if you're sick or not, without the name. Just putting that info in the device, that doesn't mean that it says it's you. Then the second thing is what conditions we have to put that. And Alexander was really right. For me, besides the control of the data, that it doesn't have to be personal. Now we are looking into a Bluetooth technology that just traces when you cross with someone else. It's not geolocalization, so GPS is not used, so it's not intrusive. But what Alexander said on decentralized information is good, because the information just goes from your phone to the phone of the person that you just crossed. It doesn't go to being stored in a central place where data can be hacked easily. However, the good thing about the centralized system is that it's much more easier to develop in a short period of time. And that's what some countries are doing, like France, United Kingdom, Norway, Australia. So I think that the goal here to be pragmatic and to make this app interoperable, because this is not going to work if someone from France has a particular app and someone from Germany has a different, and then that data cannot be crossed, because that is not going to help. So we have to find that middle way where the central system evolves towards a decentralized system. That's how I see it. But we have to understand that some countries already are going to launch centralized system apps. So we have to convince them to make that evolution, to keep the data safe, to make it temporal and only for the pandemic, which we don't know for how long it's going to stay. And then I want to bring up the third question that I don't have the answer to it, but it's a big question with this use of technologies, and it goes a little bit the way that Michel said. Are they going to be compulsory? Are we going to put incentives on society to use it? Are we going to tell them that if they don't have it, they cannot use public transport? Or yes? So of course they have to be voluntary. That's out of the question. It has to be voluntary. But if you talk to all the specialists in a given territory with a given population, that app to work, it needs at least 60% of the active population to have it. So it's quite of a challenge. So we have all to be together, and we have all to push really forward to try to conscientize people to actually use that app. And then the last thing is something that Alexander said, that there is no European company that has been able to develop this app, and there's not going to be. And that's the incapability of the European Union to create technological champions in the last decade. It's as simple as that. And that's the thing. We are going to have, I believe, and I don't like it, but we're going to have to accept what Apple and Google are developing. Because they have the infrastructure, they can put the app on the next update of the operating system on your phone. So it's going to go like that. So we have to make sure that, because this is going to happen, and most of the people are going to end up using this one, we have to put a lot of control when it comes to the data management to these two companies, and we have to focus on managing and controlling that app, because it's what is going to come. Because people at the end, they're going to go through the middle way, through the pragmatic way, and if they want to have an app, they're going to have the one that most people use, and it's going to be that one. I'm afraid with something I don't like, but I'm afraid it's going to go that way.
I
would like, Luna, sorry, just to challenge what all of us were saying, and I do agree with everything, that also we can see sometimes technology in countries like Lebanon, where we had lots of infringement from the state or paramilitary organizations, like let's say Hezbollah in Lebanon, who are using technology like WhatsApp or Signal or other technology as a way for us of protecting our independence or privacy. Just, you know.
Yeah, thank you. I actually wanted to stay with Mr. Adrian on this question because also we're going to tackle something more social now and a bit more fun. I want to ask a question about tourism. Spain is also known to be the center of tourism, a big center of tourism. And the way things are going right now, this might really be a challenge. So I wanted to pick Mr. Adrian's brains just a little and see how will, in your opinion, tourism look post-COVID-19? Because if I want to talk about tourism, perhaps in Lebanon, tourism has sort of died between brackets a while ago because we had a lot of relapses and changes and unrest in the streets. So this has sort of imposed a new state on tourism in the country. Yet Spain has been booming and booming regarding that. And now we had this crash, we had this pandemic. So I'd like to start with you on this.
Thank you, Luna. Well, the first thing is that on Easter, I have a flight to visit both Israel and Palestine, and I was planning to go in summer to visit Krise, to Lebanon. So this also affects personally to everyone. And I know that Alexander has a house in Mallorca, in Spain, so it's also going to affect him. I'm sure he's not very happy about the statement of some minister of his government asking German people not to travel to Spain. But once said that, Spain last year had 82 million people visited. From those 82 million, only 4 million were internal movements. So meaning we may lose up to 78 million people visiting, and it represents 13% of our GDP. Same thing with Greece, same thing with Malta, same thing with France, with Italy. For us, it's a catastrophe because the sector that actually pushed us out of the economic crisis was tourism. Now, I know there is a lot of work doing by several ministers of tourism from the countries that they're going to be more affected, that they're looking towards security certificates and security and sanitary conditions and standards to hotels and restaurants and bars to be open. But the problem is also, I hope that we find a solution for that. I hope that things like the app could help on this, on the traceability. I hope that the airplanes are going to be able to fly, maybe with less capacity, but people are going to start being able to move around. We really don't know what it's going to be in 1 month's time. We may have a second wave in 20, 25 days, at least in Spain or in Italy. So now we have to be prudent. We have to understand that the state, the government, they have to put a lot of budget, of money, of resources on these sectors, because if not, they're going to die. They're not going to survive the crisis. And that, at least in Spain, will be a disaster, because we may up losing up to 15, 17 points of the GDP. So we need to help them out. We need some help from the European Union, which is actually moving in that direction. And we have to make these sectors to try to survive the following weeks, and just hope that the virus and the measures that we are taking will slow down the pandemic, and we will be able little by little to try to get back to the normal life and have as many Germans, French, people from Lebanon, from everywhere in the world visiting our country.
Mr. Alexander, do you think that the global social solidarity that we witnessed and that we're witnessing during this pandemic, do you think that it's going to be something that will last post-COVID-19? We've seen a lot of solidarity, we've seen a lot of cooperation, we've seen governments and countries and civil societies across the globe supporting one another. So is this something that is going to be built up and that is going to last, in your opinion?
There may be a chance for that. That has to do also with conflicts that we see as well, because you are right, of course, Luna, in pointing out that a lot of cooperation has happened, but particularly inside the European Union, and my country is to blame for that in part, we have also seen a national reaction, a reaction that sort of, emphasizes the national dimension rather than the cooperative European dimension. And what I particularly sort of resented was, of course, when the United States president decided to cut the funding for the World Health Organization. Yes, there may be political problems at the helm of the organization with the director general. Yes, there may be too much Chinese influence at the top of the organization. But this is an organization that has 150 offices in countries around the world. And we are talking about a pandemic that is not going to, only affect the industrialized North. It affects Lebanon, fortunately not too badly, but, it will affect countries that are even a lot poorer and in a lot more difficult situation. And so we need organizations like the World Health Organization. We need NGOs like Médecins Sans Frontières. We need all of these initiatives trying to prevent the worst in the countries of what we here call the global South. Because I fear for cities like Lagos or Nairobi or Cairo. I fear the worst in parts of these towns when the virus comes and the infrastructure is what it is. And so you are absolutely right. This solidarity is needed. Will we see more of it after the pandemic? I don't know. I'm an optimist by nature. But we will also have to do an exercise in lessons learned. What was appropriate, what was not appropriate in the crisis. And I think the collaborative efforts are very appropriate. Let me say one more thing, perhaps, if I may, to Adrian. On tourism, the Croatians. Croatia has a very long coast, and Croatia is even more dependent on this sector than Spain. And they have come up with a number of ideas to develop corridors from north to south, essentially, that are sort of under sanitary standards that are, kept throughout these journeys. Maybe that's an idea for Spain, Italy, Malta, Greece, and the others to get together, because, and there I speak as someone who has an interest. Adrian was right. We here in Germany, the people in Denmark and Sweden, everybody wants to go to the Mediterranean during the summer, at least many people, not everyone, because we love the Mediterranean. And so if you come up with concepts that are safe and that people trust, and that could have positive effects for your economy, I think that's something that would be extremely appreciated. I recognize how difficult it is. I recognize that the political situation is different in Spain and Italy than it is here in the north, but just wanted to make that point.
Thank you. I have a question for Mr. Michel. Many of the local medical staff are underpaid worldwide, and I'm asking you this question because also we discussed in the beginning that it's challenging for Lebanon. Yet during this pandemic, they really emerged as real saviors, and we all know that they are heroes in regular lives. They do save our life, but they are doing this tremendous job that has forced the world to set all eyes on them. So Do you think that they will still be underpaid post-coronavirus, in the post-coronavirus era? And I'm not really talking about doctors or seniors. I'm talking about the medical staff that are on the ground, nurses, workers in the hospitals.
Well, thank you, Luna, for this question. And I'm going to start, of course, by a message of gratitude and of respect for all these people that really, throughout the world, have continued, were at the upfront of the battle against the coronavirus, has risked their lives and those of their families, and also many times had problems within their families, within their neighbors, with their landlords, even though they were praised in the media. I know, for instance, in Lebanon, dozens and hundreds of cases where we were praising them in the media, but the landlord were telling them under the radar, please get out of your home. We don't want you in the building, etc., etc. So those are people that have really risked their lives, those of their families, to save us. And I think this question of the salaries of those people that were not recognized enough, and when things changed a little bit, we saw how important they were in our society, leads to more profound questions of lots of professions that are not recognized enough within these societies, and that were seen as being B or C or D professions. And you know, one of the problems, and I'm going to go back a little bit before Corona, and that is a very big question to our liberal economies and to our liberal world, is that liberal world cannot be built only around cities, finance, consulting, or tech. And that issue really started one of the crises of liberalism, and maybe helped elect populist parties throughout the world, and one of the crises of the Brexit and others. I'm talking about Europe, is that we need to redefine or maybe to readjust our liberal economies, because having the liberal economies just in the big cities and in the fancy financial world and in the fancy offices of financial world are making big chunks of the populations feel themselves outcasted, whether it's the cities vs the countryside or the smaller cities, or is it in terms of jobs like the nurses or the medical staff that now we are praising because we lived coronavirus. But that was an issue and a problematic that was put on the table by people's votes in the last few years, where they were saying there is a problem, where many of them saying we're not against liberalism, but it needs some adjustments. And I do agree that we need to think at least and open this debate, because if I am afraid that if we do not adjust, we might have the resurgence, especially after the coronavirus, of populism against liberalism. I would prefer, and of course I would advocate, not prefer, an adjusted liberalism, not to go to populism that we might pay the price, and the world might pay the price of all the advancements we have made throughout the years and the decades in the past.
We're actually opening right now our worldwide economic crisis chapter in this panel. So this was a good contribution to actually start discussing this. I want to ask Mr. Alexander, in your opinion, will we witness more state intervention post-COVID-19? Will we see more redistribution policies?
That's a very interesting question. And also, I see in the live comments a very interesting question about the world economy concerning tensions between the US and the EU with China by Nasri Moawad. I think we will see a number of changes. One, I think it was Michel who said that we in the European Union, by and large, could have these economic packages to help our economies, our businesses. And of course, we now, as we speak, as we here meet and discuss, the people from Lufthansa, our national carrier, so to speak, which is a private company, are negotiating a bailout with the German government, or at least a liquidity bridging funding. And now you have the situation that the government says, well, but in that case, we may want to influence your business decisions. So they want a seat on the board. The socialists in our government want that. Conservatives don't, but it's an open question. And so, Luna, your question is absolutely right. Will we see more state intervention? Probably, if the state, with its deep pockets, buys stakes in companies, that may very well be one of the outcomes. Will we see more distribution? I think there's less to be distributed. Let's not forget, I mean, if the German economy crashes by 7-8%, it means that 200 billion euros are simply no longer there. They're simply, we don't create them. There's no value created when we have such a crash. I mean, we still are a wealthy nation, and we have a good standing in the capital and financial markets. But it means there's less. The pie has gotten smaller. And so while there may be calls for more distribution, including to the professions that we just spoke about, and I think we should have an entirely different seminar on the economic issues that Michel just mentioned, because I find them really, really exciting from a liberal perspective. But the pie will be smaller, and it will take a couple of years until we're back to pre-crisis economic levels. And so the question, if we do more distribution now, redistribution, it means our debt levels will have to rise. It's inevitable. With smaller pie and more distribution, you have higher debt levels. And what does it mean for future generations? Because they'll have to pay down the debt. Eventually, they'll have to pay up for it. And so I see a very exciting period ahead of us in terms of, debating our economic model, including the questions Michel raised, including the global economic model. There's one aspect in which I, as a liberal, welcome a stronger role for the state. And that is a lesson that we had to learn painfully. Medication, personal protective equipment, ventilators, antibiotics, etc. We depend on countries like Pakistan and China for these essential products. And that is a situation where I believe the services, the states have an interest in seeing to it that is no longer the case. This will be one, I hope at least, it will be one of the lessons that we learn from this pandemic.
I can see Mr. Adrian moving left and right. I can feel that he has some addition. I want to add one more question and give you the floor to answer. Actually, many of the current stabilization programs will need to be financed in the future. So does this mean higher taxes in the future and less room for maneuver for public investments?
Thank you, Luna. I couldn't agree more with both things that were saying Michel and Alexander. Economy has to change the way that we approach it, the way we look at the production sectors that we have. What Alexander said about the sanitary products and the health products, but not only that, also when it comes to develop technology, we're going to need it. Also, when it comes to coordinated common responses, we have to develop those agencies or state control agencies that they have to be ready for this kind of situation. And everything is going to change. However, for how long? Is it going to be a temporary change or is it going to be for long? No one knows. If you ask me, when it comes to state intervention and redistribution, that's already happening. In Spain, now redistribution is already happening in the European Union. But while this is happening, as Alexander said, we have less and less money to redistribute. And a state intervention is already happening. And this is going to open a huge debate, and I would say a political struggle between those who want, like the example he put with Lufthansa is clear, those political parties who want to use this to make the state intervention something that is going to last, and those who understand that this is only a temporary measure. But I'm not an economist by training, but Luis Garicano, the head of my delegation in the European Parliament, he's a well-known economist. Alexander knows him well. And when all of this was happening, I asked him, is this going to be an economic impact like happened in 2007, 2008? As an economist, what do you foresee? What is going to happen? It's going to be a U, a double B? How is it going to move? And he replied to me, look, no one ever studied or researched what is going to happen when you freeze world or global economy for 2, 3, 4 months. No one knows what is going to come after that. So definitely it's going to change. But for me, the big question is, the two big questions is for how long? Because as a liberal, I don't like a state intervention and redistribution to certain limits when it comes maybe to education and to health system and social security. Those will be my 3 topics. And the second question will be how this is going to affect to the political landscape in the countries that they have more leaning left or more leaning right governments. How it's going to change and affect these 2 future elections? What political parties are going to rally on more state intervention and redistribution? The Spanish government is right now in that side. And we look how the first thing they want to do when it comes to have really leaning left parties in the government, the first thing they said, Podemos, the Communist Party that is in government, they said, okay, universal rent for everyone. So that's the big question. That's the big question, but we'll see, no one knows.
Thank you. I want to bring this back a little bit to Lebanon, to Mr. Michel, and ask about something that we've been also witnessing, and it has been in discussion. So we do have an increase in prices. Inflation is happening all around us in Lebanon, and there's a big discussion happening about local products and about what we can produce in Lebanon. Will this, sadly, it's a pandemic, and we also need to think ahead a bit, but will there be, in your opinion, a diversification of supply chains post-coronavirus in terms of local production? Will production become more local? Will we see an increase in that? And in Lebanon, will we be forced to actually work on this aspect?
Well, the answer is to your last question, will we be forced, is definitely yes. That problematic in Lebanon, Luna, is not a coronavirus problematic. Just to give some figures to our listeners that do not know enough about Lebanon, our GDP in 2018 was around 55 billion, while our commercial deficit was of $17 billion. Just so this, to anyone that knows a little bit about economy, is a shocking figure. So actually, that was that. So if we add this, which is the commercial deficit, we add to it with cumulative deficit of the balance of payment. We add to it the budget deficit that was going, and now it's getting up around 10% of the GDP. This is what, and we add to it, of course, the peg, because the Lebanese pound is pegged to the dollars, and that created very high interest rates. What happened is that our industry and our agriculture and our local production have been throughout the last years completely destroyed, and that we arrived to a point where actually we have a financial crisis. The people do not have any more access to their money within the banks. We cannot have any more. There's, as I said at the beginning, we have a de facto capital control, which means we cannot get now any more transaction from Lebanon to outside of Lebanon or cash from the banks. It's all that is now controlled. So we do not have any more access to foreign currency. And that is not due to coronavirus. That this is due to all the factors I've talked about before. So yes, we have no other choice than to go back to economic fundamentals and go back to more orthodoxy and budget deficit, and that will need fighting corruption, restructuring the state, building new economic policies. Industry and agriculture are on the base. Apart from being a member of parliament, I'm the executive director of the Moawad Foundation, which has been one of the partners of the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation since the beginning of the 90s when we just started. And we were saying this and implementing sustainable agricultural programs since 1995 with farmers. And now I'm very proud to say that with international institutions or government like USAID or now the Netherlands, we are developing a program whereas we're accompanying farmers to be able to respect worldwide or European, how do you say, criterias, so to be able to export, and we've been able to export for the first time the Lebanese potato to the Netherlands and through the Netherlands to Europe, and we're working on developing sustainable agricultural programs, knowing that, for instance, another shocking figure is that in the state budget, agriculture represents 0.36 or 38% of our total budget, and the industry and support the industry even less. So yes, now is the time to say what, apart from the ramping corruption that has been shocking in Lebanon, we need to redefine also the structure of our state and the structure of our economy, because we do not have any more access to dollars, and that is doing a hyperinflation. Just to give a last figure, the Lebanese pound peg to the dollar was 1,500 throughout the years. We have had for the first time a black market that was at 2,000 or 2,500 starting October, and now in the last 2 weeks we've passed from 2,000 till 4,000, and we're starting, unfortunately, to live a hyperinflation that is killing the social order of the Lebanese people, and participating in that rise in poverty and in that how do you say, crash in our GDP that is going to pass very probably in the next year from 55 billion in 2018 to somewhere around 30 billion in 2020 or 21.
Thank you. I don't know if this last question in the economical chapter that we have is logical to be asked or to be answered right now, but actually maybe Mr. Alexander or Adrian can try and give us a view. So is economic liberalism on decline, or is it too hard to answer that just yet in the midst of this pandemic?
I think we are taking urgent measures in a really urgent situation. So I wouldn't say it's declining. And most of all, I mean, parties like ours and politicians like us will try to make sure that it's not going to be in decline. At least I will try to make sure that it doesn't, because I'm a true believer in that. But it's true that we have to understand that when we have this kind of critical situation, we have to take critical measures that have to prevent to get into a deeper crisis, and to try to prevent that we have more social, political, and economic unrest in the following months. So it's too early to say. And but if I have to answer, I will say no, it will not.
I agree with Adrian, and I think that you can look at the difficulties that we see across the world when governments face this pandemic. When we look strictly at the financial aspects, I mean, Germany has pursued a very, very solid budgetary policy. We were at a level of, debt to GDP was about 60%. And so we could go to the markets like this and borrow 160 billion, and it was there the next day. So if you continue with solid budgetary policies, with competitive liberal economies, that's basically a very good proposition, because it prepares the ground for you to be able to do what Adrian just said. In a crisis like this, put away the theories and start practicing what is needed. This is not the time for theories. This is really the time for action. And the room for action, that's created in better times. And that's where liberal economies come in, and that's where I think we can have again, the adjustment that Michel just spoke about, in which way do liberal economic perspectives have to develop in the 21st century so as to have an appeal also to voters, because they are demanding. We know that. We ask people to take responsibility, to educate themselves, to create businesses. It's a demanding philosophy that we have, a demanding theory. But as I said, this is not the time for theory. Now is the time for action. And when we're out of this pandemic, we're going to have a seminar on how to adjust liberal economic policy making in the way that Michel just mentioned.
And I would be happy to moderate this session then. Speaking of action, we have the international chapter right now with few questions that I have in mind, but also we have some questions looming around in the comments, so I will try to make time for everything. But speaking of action, this pandemic led to enhanced international efforts. So we've seen that more medical exchange happened. Flights cooperated even between Germany, France, and Italy, where many patients were transferred and were offered aid and support. Even Turkey evacuated some Greek staff recently. Labs are exchanging research efforts. This all looks very optimistic. Will we witness more international cooperation after this pandemic, or are we running into a decade of increased isolation, unilateralism, or closed borders even? And I want to start with Mr. Alexander again, but I also want to hear Mr. Michel, Mr. Adrian's opinion regarding this international chapter.
I'll be very brief. The global situation will be dominated over the next 10, 20, 30 years by the Chinese competition with the Americans. I think that is a reality we have to face. The question is how this will play out in other regions of the world, how it will affect us. But the rise of China and the strategic challenge to American hegemony, you can see details of it like in this WHO debate that we've just had. That's number one. Number two, so I see more tension there, not less tension, but more tension, because the pandemic is eventually, going to fade away. We here around the Mediterranean and in Europe, we should really do what I've mentioned earlier, a lessons learned exercise, and ask ourselves, what are the things that have worked? Where have we pooled resources in a way that it was a win-win situation? Where did we take measures that were counterproductive? What has not worked? I think if we do that, and within the European Union, I think we clearly do it. With our Mediterranean partners, we should do it as well. I think we may have, Luna, a chance for an optimistic outcome of increased and improved cooperation.
Thank you. Mr. Adrian, maybe you could give us a perspective on this.
I mean, it's difficult to talk about world politics after Alexander, because in quite a couple of minutes explained quite well what I also agree what is going to happen in the midterm. But maybe in the short term, there are two issues that they're going to be important. First, what is going to happen in the United States in November? If there are going to be elections, is there going to be a change? Is there not going to be? Can that shift a little bit the policy they're having with WHO, like for example? And the other thing is what is going to happen in the next months, maybe 1-2 years, with the responsibility of China when it comes to the virus. Is the European Union, is the United States going to raise its voice more on what is the consequences of actually the economic and health consequences of the virus that started in China, the fourth virus that had started in the last 4 decades in that country? Are we going to be able to somehow show some resistance to China dominance? So that will be my two only adapts from what Alexander said.
Thank you. Mr. Michel, if you want to answer, and I have one comment that we already have a sort of very limited or closed border. So this is a very interesting comment to actually go through.
Well, not to repeat what has already been said and with which I agree, I just wanted to add 2 other perspectives. First of all, we cannot answer this question if we're linking it to COVID only, without knowing what is the future of COVID-19. So are we going to find vaccine in the next year, 6 months, or 5 years. That would change a lot the answer to this question. The second thing is that there's also two directions, opposite directions. I understand that while facing COVID, each country needs to take their own policies, for instance, on the short term, close borders, or adapt their industry to COVID, or I understand that what was already said by Alexander and Adrian, that some issues or some industries have to be seen from a sovereigntist point of view, and I'm not talking about only as a country, but also, let's say, as Europe or as the US or as China, while some countries have discovered in crisis that they were totally dependent on some industries, on China or Pakistan, like I think Alexander has said, and I understand that that needs to be adapted. But at the same time, the COVID crisis has shown that it's a global pandemic, that if we do everything right in Germany, but at the same time Spain collapses, well, Germany will not be able to solve it because we cannot stay in a lockdown status. Again, it's a balance between saving lives and not ruining the economies. So a global pandemic can only have global responses. So it's a balance between how to respond on a local, first of all, on a state level or region like the Europe level, and at the same time, how to build this cooperation. And last thing is that, yes, we need to sustain that cooperation. That cooperation has to be, first of all, international, and second of all, within the governments or within the countries, it has to be a cooperative approach between the federal governments for federal countries, or the state for countries like us, the local governments or the municipalities, the private sector, the NGOs, the CSOs. If we do not have a cooperative approach and a sustainable approach, because the socio-economic effects of coronavirus are going to outlive probably Corona for years, we need to prepare ourselves to create those safety nets, not to have our social order completely be disrupted and go to chaos that would bring up populist solutions that will not work, but that will get us pay heavily the price for the next years.
Thank you. We have some questions, but before I dive into the questions, there was one that was particularly related to what I wanted to ask Mr. Michel next, and of course the gentlemen. I'm interested very much in their opinion. So someone is asking, will Europe look at Lebanon in a more positive way as far as economy is concerned? And I wanted to also add to that and ask, what will the international support look like for Lebanon post-coronavirus? And how could the EU, Western countries support Lebanon more effectively? I'm going to start with Mr. Michel and then move to hear from the expertise of both Mr. Alexander and Adrian.
Well, that's unfortunately a difficult question to answer, because Europe is looking at Lebanon and in a very positive way, and has done the maximum to help Lebanon within the limit of their capacities. Europe has a European-led SED conference, or French-led, but also with Italy, with Germany, with Spain to a certain extent. Europe has led conferences, initiatives to help Lebanon, but they were very clearly said that if we had to have Lebanon, we need the Lebanese to help themselves, and we're not anymore ready to finance a corrupt system. So we need to see very clear reforms. And although Lebanon has, the Lebanese government has promised reforms for years, we have not seen one single serious reforms being implemented, nor at the corruption level, nor at the state restructuring level, nor at the restructuring of the financial and economic system level, nor at the level of the budget deficit, nor at the level of the gray economy. And I can, go and give you, unfortunately, hundreds of examples. So that is blocking, in a way or another, the international help and the European help to Lebanon, and that we cannot blame Europe on. And now there's a new problematic, is that after the COVID-19, the countries will need their budgets for themselves. There is a very big problematic within the European countries. I need to add to this that Europe has been much more open to helping Lebanon only on the base of reforms, while other countries like the US or the Arab countries that are supportive of Lebanon historically are also linking it to political matters, linked very clearly to the Hezbollah issue, and the fact that Hezbollah is being a part of a regional division within and playing a role of getting Lebanon embedded in regional divisions. And I said this in Parliament a few months ago, saying, well, if we want to ally with an axis, with a regional axis, we should get our money from this regional axis. We want to ally with Iran / I don't know whom. Well, logically, we cannot ally with this axis and try to get money from the other axis. I mean, it never happened. So either we need to go back to our neutrality, or we're developing a model that is unsustainable. To finish, unfortunately, having said this, the people of Lebanon are feeling, because some of these are being, in a way or another, imposed on them, though we have lived elections. And the people of Lebanon are feeling that they need the help and the support of the international community, because they're feeling left apart, they're hungry, they're impoverished. And I think that we need, apart from all these issues, and that cannot be, at the end of the day, nobody can play the role of the state. But I think that we need to empower, or sorry for my English, the helps to the NGOs, CSOs, and through local governments and municipalities. So part of the solution of this problem is to do a bigger cooperation between the Europeans and the credible NGOs in the country that are playing a very important role in trying to cater for what the government is unfortunately not doing.
Thank you. Maybe a comment from Mr. Alexander, and then I have one more specific also question from Mr. Adrian. So,
yeah, let me start by saying that as a political entity, Lebanon, seen from Europe, is very important. I mean, Lebanon has taken in lots of refugees. You have one of the major international conflicts right next door in Syria, but you are still a country that, I mean, with all the domestic political issues, is somewhat maintaining a sort of, a modicum of stability. We see, of course, this Syrian conflict, and we also now see this talk of annexation of the Jordan Valley, a new dynamic in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We see the Trump peace plan. My personal view is that tensions will rise in the region, and Jordan and Lebanon are two countries where, as I said, with all the difficulties, and I'm not ignoring them, Jordan and Lebanon are two countries that provide a certain stability. And so I think that it's exactly as Michel says, we want to help Lebanon, and we want to help the stabilization. Economically speaking, and we've just heard the figures from Michel, economically speaking, Lebanon is not one of the most interesting markets for European Union companies. That's pretty obvious. But politically, you are an important country in a very important region that is very close to us. And so I think there will be more attempts to help. But we will see, I'm afraid, rising tensions over the next few months, perhaps more to the south than to the east, depending on how things evolve in Syria. But you will be definitely on our minds when it comes to helping the region.
Thank you. Mr. Adrian, one international question, maybe to try and wrap up this discussion on a more international level. And this is something that we got from the live comments. What do you think about a post-China-centric world order? Rise of authoritarianism versus democracy. And also, gentlemen are welcome to comment if they have any ideas regarding this.
That was an easy, quick question to reply, I guess. We have seen the last decade after the economic crisis how more authoritarian governments they have been popping up around the globe. We have seen that in Turkey. We have seen that in Brazil. We have seen that in Venezuela. So after this crisis, if the trend is the same, and it's something that usually happens right after huge crisis, like I mentioned in one of my previous interventions, if we don't manage to tackle somehow the social and economic crisis that we are facing, of course, people will start as well going to more populist and extreme movements, and that will always give votes for leaders or political parties that they want to go through the autocratic line. We just have to look at Hungary. What is happening? The first thing that Orban did when this crisis happened and blew was basically concentrate almost all the power he wanted. And the same we are seeing in Poland. And with a huge distance, I'm not saying this is happening in Spain because it's not happening in Spain, but in Spain, something that our president did during the first 30 days of the crisis was filtering the questions of the media, because he didn't want his management to be criticized. And of course, that changes. But in this situation where the administration, government are so stressed and where extremist movements, they usually take advantage to become and to get into power, we have to be well aware, and as liberals, the parties who are in the center, we have to be aware, and we have to fight this back. And regarding to China, we'll see. I mean, the trend goes that direction. But as Alexander said before, we may go to a different polarization between China and the United States. I really look forward, if my desire that the European Union steps up on this. I think the European Union can be the perfect in the middle power that can balance those two superpowers. And as far as we get into somehow an equilibrium, a balance of those forces, I don't think we will go to that China-centric world. But as we have been saying throughout today, this is a crisis that no one foresees, that no one was ready for, and anything can happen. So it's quite difficult to give yes or no answers to this question.
Thank you.
I'll be brief. I don't think we live in a post-China-centric world. I think what we see, or what we have seen, is China moving closer to the center of world power. I mean, the Chinese development since 1977 has been absolutely mind-boggling. And this is where I see really the shape of the 21st century is China trying to assume that role. And this is now, of course, a geopolitical observation, but it is not a neutral observation, because China is a dictatorship. We have human rights violation there every day. It's a communist country that has no freedom of expression, no freedom of media. It tries to dominate the international organization in a way that we haven't seen in the past in the United Nations and around the world. So I think for us as Democrats, as liberals, as people who believe in pluralism and freedom, we have to take a stand. And what Adrian just said is absolutely right. Europe has values. Liberals have values. And it's really important for us to get our act together to be able to defend our values, just as we need to defend our interests in this world in which this conflict between the United States and China is going to play a role. And so, therefore, no, we don't live in a post-China-centric world. It will rather go into a more China-centric world. But we will have to make very clear that this system that China represents is one that is not our system. They are a competitor. They are not a partner. They're a partner on economic and business issues possibly, but not on political issues. They cannot be because of the situation in the country itself.
Thank you. I'll be very tight on time for Mr. Michel with the comments. We have only around 2 minutes left if you have any comments regarding.
Well, I'll also be very brief because a lot was already said on this. I don't want to repeat it. But yes, I agree. So I'm just going to add to it that actually what China is doing is that if we go back to the Soviet Union times, the Soviet Union presented a model built on a dictatorship, but that did not function in terms of economy. China is presenting now another model that is built on the same logic of dictatorship, but on a more open, between brackets, or private sector economy, not built only on a state economy. So it's a mix. That mix, for the moment, has proven economic efficiency, but of course does not represent the values that we defend and advocate. So yes, I agree with both Adrian and Alexander that this is for the liberal values and for the democratic values and for the values built on freedom, a new I would say threat or a new problematic, where we will need to find a response to prove that that democracy and a developing economy are linked together and can be much more efficient than an economy that is knowing growth but built on a dictatorship. So that is going to be, those are two different models. And those are, and of course, I consider the Chinese model as being politically, at least in terms of values, a threat to the individual freedom and a threat to the values I defend, advocate, and will continue striving for.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this panel. And I'd like to invite Christophe to jump in, and because we're going to wrap this up, but it was really a pleasure to moderate this. And Christophe, the floor is yours. The virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Luna, for your moderation. It was really, really interesting. And thanks for all the speakers for your input. I think, and also, of course, thank you for all the viewers and your engagement on the comments. You made our day. And I'm happy that I have secured another debate with all the speakers and the moderator for the future. And I hope that we can maybe do this in person in Lebanon at some point, once it is possible again. And let me just finish with one short word, and that's the foundation. You know, we are based on internationalism, and I think this debate has really showed that, you know, transnational debates are so necessary, because in these debates we learn from each other and we can share best practices. And I think that this debate really has shown and crystallized why internationalism is so important. So thank you once again for this really interesting talk, and I wish you all a good evening. We need to head home now before the curfew starts to kick in at 9 o'clock.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to the Friedrich-Naumann-Stiftung. Thank you, Alexander.